Hey everyone, I hope you're all doing good. Thank you for joining us today. Super excited. So I'm Devansh from 100MS team. In today's session, we'll be building a Clubhouse clone from scratch using 100MS and React. So Tushar and Dipankar from 100MS team will be taking this session. And yes, thanks for tuning in. Okay, so a little bit about us. So who we are like live interactive audio video SDK provider. Let's say if you want to add audio video capabilities to your existing application or any application, you can use our SDKs and add all those live capabilities with just few lines of code. So you can easily start with using our pre-built templates. Whether let's say you want to video conferencing app, online, classroom, or virtual events, or anything, you can use our templates. So let's talk about agenda for today's session. So today we'll cover how Clubhouse works, introduction to 100M SDK, and we'll building a Clubhouse clone using React and 100M. And at the end, there's Q&A session and giveaway announcement. By the end of the workshop, you'll be able to learn about the 100MS React SDK and launch your own Clubhouse-like feature-rich audio room app. So before starting, I'd request you all to join our community on Discord. So on our Discord server, we share a lot about events, community programs, resources, and opportunity. So you can hover over to 100ms.live/Discord and join our community there. So yes, thanks. And now over to you, Tushar.
Okay, thanks a lot, Devansh, for the introduction. I hope you guys are as excited as I am about this because it's going to be super cool. So what we are going to do in this talk, right? We are going to build something which is similar to, let's say, Clubhouse, something like audio room with some more features, like with a lot of features. Actually, all the features from Clubhouse plus a lot of extra add-ons from our side. So I'll tell you how it's gonna work, right? I'll start with talking about the fundamental concepts, the building blocks of 100MS SDK, and what makes our SDK so simple to use without losing any flexibility or any powers. Post that, this is going to be a live coding experience with the Dipankar will take you on a journey of building a fully functional audio room. Feel free to put any questions or comments in the chat box below, and I'll try to answer them either mid-call or at the end. Before we move on to the technical details, let's cover the scope of what we are going to cover, what all we are going to build. Okay, so if you have used Clubhouse, you might have seen that there are lots of different types of people there, right? There's a group of speakers who are talking on themselves. There are listeners who are just listening to people who do not have any ability to speak themselves. We will call these roles. Okay, this is a keyword, by the way. We will use the concept of roles throughout our talk. So we will define three types of different roles which we will have for our audio room app. The first is a speaker. Now, as evident from the name, this is a group of people who will be talking to each other. Second will be listener. These guys won't have any permission to talk themselves, but they will be able to listen to the speakers. And the third group will be moderator. Now, this is just a speaker who has some additional superpowers. What are those superpowers? Okay, those superpowers are basically muting someone remotely. Someone is shouting a lot. Let's just mute them. Changing role of someone. So a listener becomes interested in being a speaker. Why? Because he wants to say something. Okay, let's ask the moderator, and they will change the role of this listener. There might be times when someone is just behaving too rudely, too weirdly, and we need to kick them out. Okay, moderator can do that as well. One more feature we will include in our audio room app will be audio level. I guess you might have seen this, right, in Clubhouse and our own web app as well at multiple places. You see, there is a hollow around those tiles where we show if someone is an active speaker, if someone is speaking, we show kind of an indicator on the UI that who is speaking at any given time. So we will include that as well as part of our UI, and finally we will include chat as well, because what live app is complete without chat, right? This will allow people to talk between themselves using text and kind of discuss about what's going on while the call is going. This is how our UI is going to look like at the end of this. So we will have all the peers who are joined, all the participants who have joined along with me in the call. We will have this chat component on the right where people will be talking to each other. We will have this control bar where you can leave the room, where you can mute yourself, where you can see what other participants are there. You will also have this context menu. So these three dots, right? This will open the menu to remove someone, to mute someone. Okay, so let's move on to the next. I guess what some of you might be thinking, right? Hey, Tushar, isn't this like a little too much to cover in an hour? Might be, if you're doing everything from studying web RTC and those stuff. It's not really with 100 ms SDK. Why is this? Because our SDK gives you such a powerful layer of abstractions for all the complexities which deals with dealing with network issues, dealing with how video flows from peer to peer, how video flows from how video flows in a multiple people call. These all things are so well abstracted, and we give you such a simple API. API will just works for you. With our SDK, as you will see throughout the call, we make all this a very simple, a matter of an hour task. Cool. Let's without wasting any more time, let's go straight to understanding what are the building blocks of our SDK. So these are the concepts, and there are only three concepts here, by the way. These are the concepts which we will need to know to understand what will come after this, what Dipankar will be covering in his live coding session. So the first concept is a room. What is a room? A room is the virtual space where people join, right? So for example, we are all part of the room where I am the host. I'm talking to you guys, and you are a sort of a guest where you are able to listen to me and interact with me on the chat if you want. The second concept is that of a peer. Peer is a synonym of participant. So each one of us is a participant in this call. We, for the sake of simplicity of implementation, we categorize these peers into two groups, local and remote. For any given browser instance, the participant who joined from that particular tab, right, they are the local peer. So for example, for my own browser instance, I am the local peer, while you all are remote peers. The third and final concept is that of role. This is the magic element. This lets you define things like what what that role can publish, who that role can subscribe to, what are the permissions and powers of the roles. This is the same thing, right, which we discussed earlier. There are going to be three roles: a speaker, a listener, and a moderator. How 100ms works is that you predefine your roles on our dashboard. You tell us what kind of people are going to be joining your call. You tell us what those people will be able to do, and our SDK manages the rest of the things for you, because our SDK plus our infra already knows what kind of room or what kind of call you're setting up. So just give a brief overview of what all you can define at the role level. The first is the publishing rights. Now, there are three kinds of streams you can think of, right? Video, audio, and screen share. At this moment, I'm sharing both all the three, my video, audio, and screen share. But in an audio room app, you might only want a peer to have audio publishing rights. In a video call app where you don't want people to have screen share, you might only want to give these two rights. So these all you can define on role basis. The second thing is permissions and powers. This is where the ability to kick someone out, remote muting someone, ending room, those sort of powers come in. So again, you can tell us beforehand that this particular role is allowed to do only these things, and we kind of restrict it from our backend itself that no one else is allowed to do those things, right? So in our case, when we are building the Clubhouse app, we will see that there is going to be a moderator role who's going to have all these superpowers. The third thing is subscribing rights. This is basically who a particular role is able to listen or hear, or listen or see. Okay, so I will take an example to cover this. So let's assume that there are three roles: a listener, a speaker, and a private speaker. And things are set up in such a way that the listener is able to listen to the speakers, but they are not able to listen to private speakers. What this means is that private speaker has a bunch of people who are able to talk amongst themselves without being audible to anyone else. In terms of subscription policy, this means that listener subscribes to a speaker, but no one subscribes to this private speaker group. So we'll cover this more as we define the roles in our dashboard, which is going to be the next thing which we do. Okay, let's start building with this. We will go, what I'm going to do next is I will go to the dashboard. There I will define these three roles, these three different roles, give them appropriate permissions, give them appropriate access to things, and then we'll start with the code. The goal of this exercise is going to be this. The goal of this exercise is that once I tell my SDK, right, once I get the token for a particular role, and once I tell my SDK that, okay, this role wants to join, the SDK takes care of rest of the things because it already knows what that role is allowed to do in some sense. Okay, without, I will go to the dashboard and we will just start with building something which helps us here, right? So let's take a audio room. Let's pick a subdomain. Okay, the subdomain is for, so 100ms gives you a website out of box which you can use without doing anything at all. We won't be covering that as part of this particular session, but you should definitely check that out if creating an account on dashboard and registering a subdomain yourself. Divyansh will be putting the link to our dashboard URL, so you could do this exercise along with me, and you could follow me while building this thing. Okay, so we will choose a temp. Okay, we won't choose a template. Let's create our own template. We already know what roles we want, right? So we'll just build them up. The first role is going to be a listener role. Now, this is the section where you define what your role is able to do, what they can publish, who they can subscribe, what are their permissions. For the listener, we don't want them to publish anything at all. So let's take all their publishing rights. Let's save it for the time being. We'll come to the subscribe strategies in a while. Now we will create the speaker role. The speaker would be able to share their audio, but nothing else. And we'll just hit save. And finally, we will create a moderator role. Again, moderator, like we discussed earlier, is just a speaker plus some superpowers. Where are those superpowers? Well, these are the checkboxes for our superpowers. So we'll just turn each one of them on. And as you see, this first one is basically about changing the role. So making a speaker a listener and vice versa. This is about remote muting someone. This is about asking to unmute someone. This is about kicking out the peer. And this is about ending the whole room. Okay. So once we have our roles in place, let's set up the subscribe strategies. As we discussed, the listener would be able to subscribe to both a speaker and moderator. And the same would apply for anyone because these are the only two roles who are going to be speaking in the call, right? The listener is only in sort of, they don't have the ability to publish audio, so they would only be in listen mode. Okay, so now that we have our role set up, we'll close this up and we will hit setup app. So our app is set up. Let's wait for a few seconds. Great, this is done. Okay, so like we saw, we can check these roles again just in case we need to change something. Uh, we we also could access our room ID from here. We can check more things from developer section. I won't show it here because it contains some secret tokens. You can go to this developer section to get those tokens to log in into our room, as the Pankaj will show in the coding session. So let's move back to where we were. I'll just recap what we did right now. We created three roles. We created a listener and didn't give them any permissions. We created a speaker role and gave them permission to share their audio. And then we created a moderator role, gave them permission to share their audio, plus a bunch of superpowers. Once these roles are in place, let's now move on to the coding aspect. I'll tell you a bit about how our React SDK interface looks like. What sort of API do we provide? How it works overall, right? So let's start with the design of the SDK interface. Now there are only two primary components in which you need to know about at any given time. Like once you start coding, based on what you need to do, you can refer to one of these components and they will answer your query. So let's start with, let's just see this diagram and I'll try to explain with the help of this particular diagram how things work. So we have two primary components. One is actions and the other is store. You can imagine a store as being a client-side database. So at any given point, it stores everything there is to know about a room, everything your UI might need to display something about the room. So this includes things like the number of peers, what other participants are there in the room, how their audio looks like, how their video looks like, is it muted, is it not muted, do you have the permissions to kick someone out, do you sort of, what devices are you using for your microphone, for your speaker, everything you need to know about of the call going on in the room, the store will have it. How UI will work out is that you will write UI components which fetch data from this store and just show them in a declarative way. And when you need to do any change, right? When you need to, let's say, mute someone, you need to mute yourself, you need to send a message, those sort of things, you will refer to this actions interface. So this is, you can imagine this as being an object with a bunch of different functions for all these things. And whenever your UI needs to do something, UI needs to respond to something, it will be calling this actions interface. We'll just see an example. We'll soon see an example to see how this actually works in practice. Basically, whenever your UI needs to know something, it calls store that, okay, tell me this thing, tell me how tell me how the, if the other peer is muted, tell me if, tell me all the messages, like tell me what message was just sent to me. Those things you'll refer to this store, and whenever you need to perform any action, you will refer to this actions interface. Let's see how this is exposed in our React SDK itself. We expose these two hooks and few selectors. So these two hooks, right? The first hook is for getting that client-side database we just talked about. So this is use HMS store. Usually you will use this with, in combination with some selector, to select a particular data from that whole database. And then the second thing is use HMS actions. This allows you to take actions, which are again this joining, muting someone, and changing role and those things. And for those of you who are not familiar with hooks, you can imagine hooks as being sort of a smart functions which return something. So for now, assume them as just being normal functions, and I'll explain where the smartness comes in. Okay. So let's take an example to see how these three things come together to build something functional. We'll take an example of a button which toggles your own audio, which allows you to mute or unmute yourself. So is a functional component. This has a button as we see, and on the click of the button, we call this function. How this function works is that first we for toggling audio, we need to know what the current state is, right? So because we want to know some state, we refer to our use HMS store hook, and we pass it a selector. Select is local audio enabled to know whether, what's the current state? Is my audio currently on mute or is it currently unmuted? Once we have the current state, because I need to toggle it, because I need to change it, that is an action. So I get the actions from this hook. And then we get the new audio state, which is the reverse of the current state. And we call this function on our actions interface to set the new state. If you see this flow, you'll see that how most things will work is that you fetch something from this store, you get the current data, then you sort of, whenever you need to do something, whenever you need to perform action, you get the actions object and call a function over it. Okay. where the smartness and hooks come from, right? For those of you who are unfamiliar with hooks, the smartness comes in line number 2. So if this changes, if the current mute status, if the current unmute status changes, React takes care of re-rendering this functional component. That is, if let's say if you're showing a different button for muting and unmuting, right? React will take care of re-rendering this functional component, so your UI is always correct at any given time. Which means you don't have to worry about listening to changes in data. You don't have to worry about being careful with changing your UI to kind of sync with what's going on in the room. You just have to write declarative code. You just have to write how you want your UI to look like given a particular state of the store, and everything else will be taken care of by our SDK plus React itself. So I'll just recap what we did. We discussed what all we are going to build here. We saw how the UI is gonna look like. We talked a bit about our SDK. We went through the building blocks, which is room, peer, and roles. We talked what roles mean. Then we actually went to the dashboard and defined these 3 roles, which we'll be using in our code for Clubhouse. And then we went on how our SDK interface looks like, what actions in store mean, and we discussed how the selectors and hooks allow us to write a basic functional component. I will hand over to Dipankar next. So he will take you through the journey of actually using those hooks properly in our code to build a very beautiful audio room app in React. Over to you, Dipankar.
So thank you, Tushar and Divyansh, for helping them getting started. And Tushar explained how the HMS store actually works and all those things, and getting your client secrets from the developers section in the dashboard. I will just have some few slides and then just get right into the programming aspect. So first thing that you want to do is just clone this repo. The link would be in our description. And about this repo is that this is basically a boilerplate repository for getting started quickly to make my life and your life easier. It has 2 branches. First one is the template branch, which is the boilerplate configured with create React app plus Tailwind. So we are using Tailwind as our styling solution here, but we won't be using it that much because all our components are already having all the utility classes added. Main branch is basically your entire Clubhouse clone code, and if you want to get skip all these things and you just want the code, then just clone the main branch. If you clone the repo and go to the template branch, you will find there's 3 folders inside the src folder. First one being the components, which contains the dump stateless React component, which will handle our UI. Some of these components actually have props that some of these components actually need props, which we'll be getting into once we start the programming thing. The icons folder have all our icons, that's React SVG components, and utils folder would have all our utility functions such as the get token function and all that. So as Tushar explained in our last in the last session that you have to go into the developer section and get your client secret. So we'll be needing 2 of our secrets. First one being your token endpoint and the app room ID. So how you can actually add it in your application. So if you run the script cp example.env and .env, it will create a template.env file for you, and you have to just add your respective token endpoint and your room ID, and then you're good to go. So Tushar has already explained this, but I will just quickly recap it. That first, to harness all the things that are being provided by the React SDK, you first need to initialize the SDK. And how you can actually do it is just wrap your app component with HMS room provider. So my basic statement is that the store plus selector plus action is basically answer to everything. If you want to leave the room, if you want to join the room, you just have to call the actions. If you want to know a particular state at a particular time, you just have to use the selector function and it will get it from the store. So enough talk, let's start the programming aspect, and wish me luck. May the coding gods are with me. So another thing is that we already have, as I explained, you have to clone this thing. It has 2 branches. First one is the template, so you have to clone the branch. And if you think that we also have a blog which covers everything from what Tushar explained and every code aspect that we're going to add it here. So you can also follow it if you like the blog approach more. So now let's start the programming thing. I've already cloned the application and I already have the src folder, and inside it's the components, icons, and the utils one. I've started the server with yarn start, and you can see that initially this thing is being rendered here. This is basically an input, speaker, and the join room button. If I click on join room button, nothing is really happening, and that is because we haven't added any type of functionality. As I said that all of these are dumb components. We don't have any 100ms related or any audio video conferencing functionality added yet. So let's just go into the app component and try to find out what is actually happening here. There's this variable called as is connected and it's set to false. And since this is false, it's rendering the join component. So what if I make this true and save it? All right. Yeah. So what is happening here is then this room component is being rendered. And what this basically means is that the logic is that if the user clicks on the join button, you should actually join the room and the room component would be rendered. But how do we actually know that which person is in the room or not? So this is where 100ms SDKs shine. I will just uncomment this part. And to know that a person is connected to the room or not, there's this selector function called as select is connected to room. And what this selector function gives us is that a Boolean value whether the person has joined the room or not. How we can actually access this variable? Well, we just have to use the HMS store and pass the selector function inside it. Now is connected is the actual Boolean value that will know if the peer is actually connected to it or not. Now if I save, it's compiling. I should get an error because in the first slide I explained that you have to first wrap your app component with HMS room provider. So why I didn't do it? Because I wanted to show you how well the 100ms SDK actually shines. I did a very basic mistake, and it actually tells me what I have to do. So it's telling me that you have to add an app, you have to wrap your app component with the top level HMS room provider. So I will just do it now. Just take this inside. So everything is cool, and I can see that is connected is false because the join component is being rendered. And that is actually correct because we haven't actually connected to the room. Now, if I click on join, nothing happens. And that is because we haven't added the join functionality yet. So if I hover over the select is connected to room thing, it is having a nice note which says that it will only return true only after the peer has actually joined the room. And so let's get into how we can actually join the room. Since this component is join component, let's just get into join component first. And now let's just see. So this is basically our UI logic. First one is the avatar. So now if I type all these things are being controlled by this username state and the selector function. Not the selector function, the selector input is basically going to control all our roles. The join room, if I click on join room, it is basically fire the join room function, which is empty currently. So how we can actually join a room with the help of 100ms SDKs? So to join a room, you first need you need a token. First you need a token. So to join a room, you have to first call the HMS actions. So HMS actions has a couple of actions. So one of them is the join room. So if I call HMS.join function, it needs two parameters. First one is the username and the second one is the auth token. So how do I get this auth token? In the beginning, we added our token endpoint in our .env file. And I also told that in utils folder, there's a get token function there. So if I go to the get token function, you will see that it makes a post request on our token endpoint and sends a body params. And it also taking a room ID as a room ID. It's also taking room ID as a field, but it also needs a role as a parameter. So how this thing will actually work is that when the person clicks on join room, it will get a token, it will make the post request and return a token. And after that, you have to pass this token and the username inside the HMS action function. I'll just try to do it. I will just uncomment these things out. And we'll also create an instance of use HMS action. So const actions to use HMS action. Right. Now let us try to get the token first. So token takes a param of role, and role is being controlled by this state. So I will just pass it over here. This will return a promise. So it will return a token. Let's just try to call HMS action dot join. This takes a config. First one is the username, which is being controlled by this username variable. And let's just pass our auth token, which is basically T. Now it also takes an optional settings object, which is basically that when a person joins the room, he should join with muted status or video on off or status. Since we are building an audio application, we don't have to add the video thing. So we'll just pass is audio muted as true, because we don't want the person to have the mic on when he joins, right? Let's just save this thing. I just try to add a name. I will join as speaker. If I click on join room, I see that welcome to the room is being rendered. Why is this actually happening? Since HMS store, if you go into our app component, and if I hover over this again, you can see that it will only return if the user has joined. So I have created the join room functionality, and if I'm successfully joining a room, this selector function would return true, and hence would render the room component. All right. So if I go into the room component, I just see this thing called as welcome to the room. But this is not something that we actually want. We want to like see people who are actually in the room or not. So how we can actually do it? Again, the answer to everything is the HMS store, the actions, and the selector functions. So I will just uncomment this out. And if I hover select peers, you can see that this will return an array of peers which are remote or local present in the room. This is exactly what we actually want. Now let's just try to get all the peers that are in the room. So use HMS store and then select peers. Right. So peers is actually giving me an array of HMS peer. But how do I know what is the actual interface of HMS peer? So VS Code has this nice thing that you can actually use is that if I click on command and then click, and then if I click on HMS peer and click, you can actually see what is the interface of HMS peer. There's a couple of things that we want. First one is the ID, the name, and the role name. Right. Since all our SDKs are written in TypeScript, we get this nice type declaration if you want to deep dive and just see what is the actual type of this thing. Now, how to actually render this thing? Since this is an array, we will just use the map function of the JavaScript. So peers.map p. We will use the user component that I already built. So what this user component actually takes as a param is the peer. So if I do peer and p, since we are like using React array here, we have to also pass a key. Key should be unique, so we will just going to be using the ID component. Now if I save, so I can see my name and my role here. So how is this actually happening? Because the HMS peer has all these properties that we actually need. And the user component is basically taking all these props and just rendering it in the HTML tags. Awesome. So, but another thing is that we actually want to have the person to have the ability to like mute and unmute themselves, basically having controls or to having the ability to leave the room. So how I can actually do this thing? Now let's just this component called as footer. I've already created it. So let's just try and add it here. What this footer actually takes as a param is basically the count, and count is basically the amount of peers that are in the room. So if peers dot length x length, save it now. I can see that there's one person in the room currently. Now let's just join from another tab. Just down with my dog's name, which is Duma. Can join room. Now if I go to the other tab, I can see Duma is here, and this thing is becoming 2. But if I click on this leave room and all these things, nothing is really working because these are just dumb UI components and there's nothing functionality added here. So if I click over footer component, you can see that there's a couple of things that we can see here and here. First one is the leave button. It's taking a function, but it's empty, right? That is why nothing is happening here. So audio button is taking a prop which is active. If I make it true or false, this icon would actually change. So how we can actually leave a room? Well, the answer for that is use HMS action. So let's just create an instance of it. HMS action is called use HMS action. And now if I write use HMS action and use a leave function, you can see this function is exactly what we want. This function can be used to leave the room. Right. Now if I save and go to the Dumas tab and click on leave. When I click on leave, the select is connected to room becomes false and hence the user leaves the room. Now if I go to my own tab, I can see that Duma has left the chat and this thing has also become one. So it is super easy to build application. You don't have to handle the state. That is pretty cool. Let's just work on the ability to mute and unmute myself. Right. So to know that what my current state of my audio status is, use a selector function called as select as local audio enabled. This will return a boolean denoting whether your local audio is unmuted or muted. So to harness this thing, I will just since this function is this constant variable is false. So what if I make it this true? Let's just try it out. If I make this true, this thing becomes true, but this is not something we want. We don't want to hard code it. So we'll just use a selector function to get the current state of that thing. Now, obviously, this is false. This will return false because we have joined the room with the false with the false thing. But how to actually unmute myself? So to do that, answer is HMS action. So if I write HMS action dot set audio, set local audio enabled, and what this takes as a param, it takes a boolean which is enabled or false. So if I pass true here, my audio status would become true. I have muted myself. But we want this to be with the sync with this thing, right? So if I click on this thing here, this is currently false, so it should basically become true. If this is true, it should become false. So what you want to do is oppose it to what our current status is. If I save, click on this thing, my audio status changes, right? I'm actually speaking. The audio streams are actually transferred, right? You can see this icon. This is actually shining because we are actually speaking. So if I close it, I have muted myself. Amazing, right? So now I have the ability to do that thing. But if you observe one thing, that if I unmute myself, this thing still becomes mute. And this is because we are not having this in sync with it, because we haven't added that functionality. So let's just try to do it. Let's go to the user component. As you can see, this user component has two hard-coded things. First one is the audio enabled, which is false. If I make this true, this thing will become true. We don't want to hard code it. So how we can actually get all those things? Let's uncomment these things out. So select is peer audio enabled would actually return us the peer's audio status. It takes peer ID as an argument. So let's just try to use it. This is exactly what we want. So use HMS store and pass the select is peer audio enabled, and we can get the peer ID. Since this is a prop from the parent component, we can just use peer dot id. If I save and if I unmute myself here, this is in sync with it because the HMS store is returning me what the current state is. If I mute myself again, this thing is in sync. Now you might have observed in a couple of platforms such as Zoom and even 100ms and Clubhouse that when a person is speaking, you get that nice border highlight there. So just add that functionality here. The level is currently 0. So what if I make it 100? You can see this box shadow here. So what if I make it 50? It will decrease. So how we can actually know what is the audio level of that specific peer? And this is where select peer audio by ID comes into place. This will return an audio level of audio track with the given peer ID. So I just use the HMS store, pass that thing here, select peer audio by ID, and pass the peer.id thing. Now, if I start speaking by unmuting myself, you can see that this border is becoming bigger and smaller based on my audio levels. So if I mute myself, the audio level would go to 0 because I'm not speaking. Awesome. So we have added this feature now. Let's move on to the second last feature of our, which is the ability to change roles or change permissions. So when you are speaking in a conference or in a webinar and another person just joins and starts unmuting himself and starts speaking observe, you should have the ability to moderate these things. You should have the ability to kick him or herself, should the ability to mute himself, or the ability to like change the role to the listener status. So we will try to add that functionality. And how we can actually do it is we already have a component that I've built. First one is the permission one. So let's just try to render it over here. Now if I save, I hover over this thing. There's a simple context menu which has mute and make listener and make speaker. But if I click on mute or make speaker, nothing works. And that is because the functionality isn't added. This is just a simple UI component. Permission takes two props. First one is the audio track and the second one is the ID. Let's just pass it over here. So ID is basically peer.id and the audio track is basically peer.audio track. That's it. If I go into the permissions component, I can see that there's like three functions. First, not three functions, there's two functions. So mute peer would be called when we click on the mute button, and make listener and make speaker have a common function, which is the change role. And it passes the respective role that is being present here. And all of these functions are currently empty. So how can we actually change roles? And this is where the 100ms SDK really shines. This is the superpower, which is the change role API. So to invoke a change role API, we need three things. First one is the remote peer ID, which is basically the peer ID of the remote peer whose role we want to actually change. The second thing is the to role name, which is the target role name. And the third param is the force one. So if I want to like, if I don't want to give the other user a chance to like accept or reject that thing, then I can just force him to. So force is basically a boolean, so we can just pass it as true. Right. So how can we actually change a role? Before changing a role, we will try to implement the mute peer functionality. So to mute someone, we will just use the HMS action. Let's just uncomment this thing and let's just create an instance quickly. HMS action is equal to use HMS action. And now if I click on HMS action dot set what was the remote track enabled, what this function actually takes, change track state of a remote peers track, and this can be used to unmute and mute a remote peers track. This is exactly what we want. And it takes a parameter which is the remote track ID, and also takes a second parameter which is basically if you want to mute or unmute or not. So if you want to mute him, then it will be false. If you want to unmute, then it will be true. So you already have the audio track being passed from a parent component. So let's just put it here. And the second one is false since we are only wanting to mute. So let's just try it out. Now, if I go to the Dumas tab and try to join with the speaker's role, I will join the room. Now, if I unmute Duma and he's starting to speak, before that, we actually want to join as a moderator. So I will just join as a moderator. And now, since Duma is speaking, I don't want him to speak. So what if I click on mute? He's muted. So that is the superpower that you can actually mute and unmute other people. And we have just added the functionality in just one line of code. Awesome. Now just work on the change role thing. I already have the role params that I'm getting here. So HMS action dot change role. What are the three params? First one is the peer ID. I'm getting it from the parent components. I will just pass it over here. Second one is the role, and the role I'm getting it from the function param. And the second one is the force attribute. We want to force the user. We don't have to give him the second chance. Now I'm in the moderator tab and I decide that I want to make Deep as a listener. I will just click on listener thing and he's a listener now. So he can't mute or unmute himself. Now if I go to Dipankar's tab, since I'm a listener, if I click on mute or unmute, this thing won't work because the listener doesn't have the ability to speak. All of these things are in sync with our settings that are policies that have been set up in the dashboard and even in the HMS store. Now if I plan to make him speaker again, I will just click on make speaker. Now he can unmute himself. If I go to his tab, click on this thing. For some time, I just mute and unmute it quickly because an echo would come because I'm just using it from my same machine. Awesome. So one thing that you could have noticed is that if Dipankar is a speaker and Duma is a less speaker too, but they're still able to see this context menu. But even if they click on make speaker mute, they can't actually do it because it's against the policy that we have set up in the dashboard. So to only render the permissions component, if it's a moderator, we will try to implement it. Let's go into the user component. And let's just only render this permission component if the moderator is actually a speaker. How do we know a local peer? So select local peer is a function which will return a local peer object, which is assigned to that person. So let's just try to get a local peer. So const local peer is use HMS store and select local peer. Now we have the access to the local peer. Now just do this thing is mod, which is local peer dot role name is equal to moderator. Now we know that if the peer is moderator or not, let's just conditionally render this thing. So if this thing is true, then only render the permissions component, and if not, we'll just return null. Now as you can see, all the permissions, all the context menu thing are gone. That is because the person isn't a moderator, he's a speaker. If I go to the Dumas tab, same thing. But if you go to the moderators tab, you can see that thing. Let's just make him a listener. Let's just make him a listener. Let's just make him a speaker. Let's just make him a speaker. Everything is possible. Now moving on to the last thing, which is the chat functionality. And adding chat is super simple. Let's just go into the room component. We'll just uncomment this thing out. Try to render it. Save it. You can see that this boilerplate code is being added. So if I type hello world, on enter, nothing really happens because we haven't added the functionality. So I'll just uncomment these things out and create an instance to HMS action since we're going to be using it. So when the person clicks on enter, the send message function is being fired. So if I send message function is currently empty, so how can I actually send a message? We use the HMS action dot send broadcast message, and what my current message is in the state, which is the chat input. So I'll just pass it. One nice thing that we can add is that if the person clicks on enter, this chat should like change to an empty string. How we can actually do it? So just change the state to an empty string. Now I will prove you that this message was actually sent to the 100ms infrastructure. So I will just type this message was sent. Enter. Things become empty, but we are not actually seeing a message here. But I guarantee you that it's actually sent to the servers. So how we can actually get all our messages? Well, we use select HMS messages selector function. This will return an array of messages that are being sent in the room and received in the room. Just try to harness them. So messages, use HMS store and the select message function, selector function. Now we get an access to it. It's super easy to do it. We'll just map over it. Map. And we already have a component that I have created to make our life easier, which is the chat component. And what that component takes as a prop, first is the key, obviously. So it also has a ID attribute. This will help us out. And it's also taking an MSG, which is our HMS message object, which is the M thing. If I save, you will see that this message was sent is coming up. And I proved my point that this message was actually sent and it's actually being sent. Now, if I send a message, go to the other tabs, I can actually see that my message is being sent. If I say that hello Duma and send it, it will be there. So we have added all our functionality that we were supposed to. We joined the room, we left the room, we were able to unmute and mute ourselves. We are able to see our audio levels. We have the ability to change roles, and we have the ability to send messages. And all of this was possible to build in just some lines of code. We have hardly added more than like 50 lines of code to add a simple functionality. That is really amazing, and I really wish that you can that you build something out of it, even add more features than what we have added here. There's a couple of more features that you can add, and you can also build video rooms and Zoom like application very easy. So I will just wrap up with like showing you some of the things. First of all is our GitHub repository. You can see the entire code that we use today in this thing. If you go to the main branch, you have all our code. You just have to replace your env, and then you can have an entire application on your own. If you go to the blog, this blog has everything that we have covered in today's session. It has everything that Tushar explained to what I have live coded here. So you can follow this too if you want to, if you missed some things, and you can always go to the source code if you want to. If you have any questions, if you're stuck, please join our Discord server. It's really active and we would love to help you out in your projects. Feel free to share it on the showcase channel. That's it from my side.